Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to day 2 of Africa, Israel, and Their Descendants, presented by the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm your host, once again, Maria Washington, and will be facilitating tonight's conversation. Part 2 of our discussion, Ancient Friendship, Africa and Israel, will be led by IPSI board member and CEO of DAISY International, Olga Mshwe-Washington. Like we said yesterday, this is a regular Zoom session in which you will be able to interact with the speaker. So during the Q&A portion, you will be able to either type your question in the chat and I will read it for you, or you can use the reaction function at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand and I can call on you one by one to unmute your microphones and ask your question. Of course, we ask that you all mute your microphones until we've come to the Q&A portion following the lecture. We are also live streaming to our IPSI Facebook page, so the recording for tonight's discussion can be found there afterwards. Again, welcome to day 2 of Africa, Israel, and Their Descendants. Olga, the floor is yours.
Sorry about that, but a very warm welcome to everybody. Good evening. We are so excited that you have joined us on the second evening of IPSI's 3-part series. Yesterday, we heard from our Executive Director, Joshua Washington. I'm so happy to be with you this evening. And tomorrow we will be hearing from our founder, as well as President Dumisani Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the privilege as a child of Africa, I'll give you a little bit of detail as I go along, to bring to you a topic that many people are not familiar with, but that is so important if we are going to look at Israel. And that is this ancient relationship that Africa has with Israel. In fact, this relationship is over 3,000 years old, and it has been a close bond that has seen a shared interest over things such as politics, the economy, as well as various other strategic interests. There's also the history of religion, as well as faith, identity, as well as geography. Now, because of COVID, I know that some of us have been stuck. We haven't been able to do as much travel as we would like to do. And so I would like for you to join me on a journey, both geographical as well as in time, as we explore this particular topic. When you think of Africa, many people think of poverty. They think of children who are malnourished. If you have a look at the screen, the young boy, he's got this expanded belly. That's as a result of disease called kwashiorkor. They think of war and they think of dilapidated buildings and just uncivilized people and development that is so much in need. Ladies and gents, a couple of years ago, The Economist ran a title on its front page saying that Africa was a hopeless continent. A couple of years later, however, in the year 2011, it changed the front page of its cover. And the reason that it did so is that it noticed that there was something that was brewing on the African continent, that Africa indeed was rising. And a year later, Time magazine had the exact same cover. In its feature article, it noted that at least 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were on the African continent. It noted many other interesting facts of which we're going to look at today and said that there was something that was special about Africa. And so when you see news and reports of poverty and war, I want to challenge you today. I want to challenge that thought and say, that's just a mirage. My Africa, the Africa that is rising, is an Africa that is rich. It's an Africa that is vast. If you have a look at this slide, the mass of Africa is over 30 million square kilometers. For you Americans, that's over 11 million square miles. In fact, Africa is so large that you can fit all of these nations and more on the mass of Africa. The United States of America, India, all of Western Europe, China, Argentina. Africa's youth. She's got a vibrant youth, and not just youth, young people. She has got a lot of talent. She's got human capital to offer the world. And I say human capital to offer the world, even though the vast majority in some countries, unfortunately, many countries are unemployed. But ladies and gents, for me, this is not hopeless. For me, this presents opportunity. It presents employment potential. I mentioned the youth on the African continent. Reports and statistics show that up to over 60% of the world's youth exist on the African continent. And so here you have a vibrancy, you've got innovation that is just waiting to happen. So we're rich in terms of our human capital. Here's a slide that many of you may have never seen before with regards to this particular picture. Did you know that Africa possesses 30% of the world's resources? Ladies and gents, you only need to look at Africa and you will be able to discover the fact that she has got diamonds, gold, nickel and uranium, fish, timber, titanium, graphite, tobacco, iron ore, phosphates, aluminum, gas, oil, copper, all of these found on the African continent. All of these not only found on the African continent, but all of these powering many economies across the world. But unfortunately, Africans themselves don't enjoy that wealth. This is a report that was produced by Honest Accounts, having a look at the money that came into the African continent and the money that left the African continent up until the year 2016. You'll see on the top right-hand corner that an amount of approximately $162 billion US dollars came in, but $203 US billion left, which means, ladies and gents, that Africa, my Africa, is not a debtor. So yes, oftentimes you hear of Africa and you hear of this African continent where she's begging the world and asking for aid and help us, help us, help us, because she doesn't have. We already saw on the last slide that she's rich in resources. And here we're seeing that if we're talking financial wealth, we're talking money, currency, Africa is not a debtor to the world. Africa is in fact a creditor to the value of 41 billion US dollars. Let's break down how this equation comes to. At the end of 2015, approximately 19 billion US dollars came to Africa in aid grants, but 68 billion US dollars left in capital flight. What do I mean by capital flight? Unfortunately, we have corporations which we're grateful for in their existence on the African continent, these multinationals, but there's not always honest dealings with these multinationals. And so this capital flight represents inaccurate, deliberate inaccurate reporting of the value of the exports as well as the value of the imports so that there can be tax evasion. 67.6 billion US dollars flows out of the continent because of illicit financial transactions. 29 billion US dollars leaves the continent of Africa because of illegal logging, fishing, as well as trade in wildlife and plants. And 10.6 billion US dollars is spent by African nations having to make amends for the greenhouse emissions, as well as the carbon footprint of the rest of the world. So it has to make adjustments for contributions to the greenhouse effect. That's not its fault. And then also has to spend a further 26 billion US dollars in order to make further adjustments with regards to climate change. Now, ladies and gents, if you look at these numbers, you can see that there's a lot of money that's leaving the African continent that shouldn't be leaving it at all. Now that we've visited the African continent, let's go back in time. And we're going to go to the turn of the 20th century. The gentleman on our screen, many of us may be familiar with his face, is Theodore Herzl, who is known as one of the founding fathers of modern Zionism. As he was contemplating together with his peers as to the liberation, or rather the redemption, of the Jewish people in their own homeland, he didn't just think of the Jewish people alone, he thought of Africa. He thought of Africans. In fact, he said, there is still one other question arising out of the disaster of nations which remains unsolved to this day, and whose profound tragedy only a Jew can comprehend. This is the African question. Just call to mind all those terrible episodes of the slave trade of human beings who, merely because they were Black, were stolen like cattle, taken prisoner, captured, and sold. Their children grew up in strange lands, the objects of contempt and hostility, because their complexions were different. I am not ashamed to say, though I may expose myself to ridicule for saying so, that once I have witnessed the redemption of the Jews, my people, I wish also to assist in the redemption of the Africans. So he said this at the turn of the 20th century. So a question that we should ask was that, was there any change in the attitude of the Jews once they found their liberation, their redemption, and their state of Israel once it was formed? The answer to that, ladies and gents, is no, that attitude did not change. In fact, if we look to the first female prime minister of Israel, Ms. Golda Meir, she said this with regards to Africa. Like them, we had shaken off foreign rule. Like them, we had to learn for ourselves how to reclaim the land, how to increase the yields of our crops, how to irrigate, how to raise poultry, how to live together, and how to defend ourselves. Golda Meir believed that Israel could provide a better model for the newly independent state because Israelis had been forced to find solutions to the kinds of problems that large, wealthy, powerful states had never encountered. Now, when she talks about these newly independent African states, you'll see that at the time of her coming into power as prime minister in the 1960s, 1970s, going back even further back to the 1950s, that was a time when many African nations were being liberated from their colonial powers. And in their liberation, they found themselves in need with regards to assistance so that they could build their nations. That then takes us to see what was happening on the African continent and whether Israel had any role in what was taking place. Did you know that Israel was amongst the first countries to extend substantial assistance to newly independent African countries? Now, if you look at the date, 1950s to 1970s, this was soon after Israel had herself been declared as a state. So she was a baby state, yet instead of not just only looking to herself, she extended a helping hand to Africa and African states. In fact, let me pause here for a second. You may have heard, and you'll continue to hear, that I use the term Africa and African nations or African states interchangeably. And I say this knowing that Africa comprises of many countries. In fact, it comprises of 54 countries, 54 nations. And I know this because I'm a child of Africa. I hail from South Africa. The reason why I use this interchangeably is just for ease of presentation. So let nobody get confused that, oh my gosh, does she actually know that Africa is not one country when she references it as if it is? I do. Israel's presence on the African continent as these nations were becoming independent saw her participating in helping these countries establish agriculture, establish medicine setups, defense. The Israeli Defense Force had a very big role to play, infrastructure. If you go to many African countries and you ask them, who built your roads? Who built that hospital? Who built those particular businesses? Who built those buildings, those universities? The answer in many of the African states is Israel. She was involved in setting up educational systems for the African people, professional training institutions, housing, and settlements. Now, many of these projects were not only carried out by whether it was private individuals or people that just wanted to extend their hand, but also deliberately by the Israeli government. So political as well as economic and strategic interests saw close ties continue to be built during the 1950s and 1970s between African countries and Israel. So much so that Israel had a presence in terms of embassies, so diplomatic presence, in 33 countries across the African continent. She was second only in number to the United States. Let's talk about the currency of Africa at that time. The Egyptian pound and Zambian kwacha were stronger in the exchange rate, stronger than the US dollar and equal to the British pound. If you were to look at what their exchange rate is today, it's nothing like that. Ethiopia, a place that many people think of, they think of slavery, they think of poverty, they think of disease, drought. That wasn't Ethiopia at that time. Ethiopia was she had a flourishing economy. Food was aplenty, there was peace. Zambia at the time, while Israel was present, she was the world's third largest exporter of copper. Singapore, once it became an independent state, came to Africa, came to Zambia and said, teach us how to be a thriving state. Imagine that. A country from the East coming to Africa and say, show us how it's done. So ladies and gents, we need to ask ourselves a question, what happened? We saw the pictures at the beginning of this presentation. Poverty, hunger. You look at this particular picture, and it's an accurate, unfortunate description of some parts of Africa, and that's war. So what happened? Today, of the 25 poorest countries in the world, African countries comprise 18 of those 25. Wars, civil wars, political instability, famine, corruption, poverty. These unfortunate incidences, when you turn on the news, when you Google, when you read across what people are saying on social media, Africa now, unfortunately, provides story after heart-wrenching story of suffering. But we saw that that wasn't the case. So we need to go back, or rather we need to move forward, because we were in the 1950s, 1970s, beginning 1970s, and see what happened in the middle of the 1970s. Those of us that know our history with regards to the wars in Israel know that in 1967, we had the Six-Day War. And that was a turning point with regards to how Israel was viewed. Before then, she was viewed as, you could say, a David. But after that, because of her surprising, miraculous victory, she was viewed as a Goliath. And in winning the Six-Day War in 1967, she gained a lot of land. So we found then that in the early 1970s, many Arab leaders started to apply pressure on African countries, on African leaders, and say, you see what happened in Israel? You see how they took land? You see how the Palestinian people are suffering? And even though that term Palestinian people was coined later, but we won't go into that. But you see how your brothers are suffering, and they use that term very deliberately, your brothers, because one of the large religions on the African continent is Muslim, or rather Islam. So there's a lot of Muslims. And so they said, you see your brothers? That's what they did to your brothers. This is what they're going to do to you. You have allowed Israel, you've allowed the Jews to be on the African continent, the very same way that they've colonized Israel, they've colonized Palestine. You see what they've done to your brothers? They're going to do the same thing to you. But then also, because we had the presence of nations such as Egypt and nations such as Sudan, where we had the infamous Khartoum conference, where there was a total rejection of Israel, a total denial of any effort to negotiate with her or have any form of peace with her. They were like, we are here on your continent. We are your brothers. You need to stand with us, show us solidarity. But furthermore, there was blackmail. If you don't cut your ties with Israel, we won't help you in your needs. But if you do cut your ties with Israel, we promise to help you more so than Israel has ever helped you before. There was also propaganda. Now, if you have a look at the attitude of many of the, not just the ordinary person on the ground in Africa, but the African leaders, for the most part, they dismiss this. In fact, this is a picture of the then president of the Central African Republic, President Dako, when he visited Israel in 1962. And at that visit, he said to Israel, you have not tried to create us in your image. Instead, Israel has contented itself with showing the new African nations its achievements, in helping them overcome their weaknesses, and assisting them in learning. So even though there was this noise about, look, what the potential harm that Israel can do, for the most part, the African leaders were able to stave that off. But the Arab leaders were very persistent. We also had the oil embargo that happened in the 1970s, until unfortunately it came to a place where country after country after country cut its diplomatic ties with Israel. And unfortunately, it didn't just cut those ties, it actually kicked out Jews that were living in the country. So if you have a look at this particular diagram, it just illustrates the different pressures that ultimately caused many of these African nations to unfortunately cut their ties with Israel. If we're going to look at the term friendship, there was a breakup in the friendship at this time. There was Big Brother pressure, I've already spoken to that, Libyan and Saudi bribes. So there was bribery. There was also a little bit of pressure from the Soviet government, but then also the pressure with regards to the oil embargo, as well as other forms of sanctions that were threatened. So if you think like me and say, okay, what then happened? So when Israel seemed to have, or rather when Israel was on the African continent, things were thriving. When she left, things seemed to go down. Is that how we now find ourselves where we are? If you're a person of faith, like I am, you may be familiar with the scripture, Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, where God says to Abraham, speaking to Abraham with regards to his descendants through the promised child Isaac, he said, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And the cutting of the ties with Israel and the kicking out of the Jews who had helped many of these African nations establish themselves, Africa, unfortunately, had cursed Israel. Maybe you say you're not a person of faith, so Genesis 12:3 doesn't apply. But you'd have to admit that there's a causal link that can't be denied, that when Israel was present, things were good. That when Israel's gone, things are bad. And no, I'm not at all saying that it's all up to Israel to do everything, not at all. But that's something for further consideration, and we'll chat about it a little bit later. Now, this particular hashtag, many of you may remember, 2014. It was all over social media. Bring back our girls. We had high-profile politicians, high-profile celebrities. Bring back our girls, bring back our girls. Who were these girls? 276 girls, the majority of them Christian, in Nigeria were kidnapped. These girls were between the ages of 16 and 18. And where were they when they were kidnapped? They were at school, just wanting to get an education. They were kidnapped by one of the most ruthless terrorist organizations on the African continent, Boko Haram. If I can pause there, Boko Haram, who pretty much comes from the same tree as Hamas, another terrorist organization that many of us are familiar with. So Boko Haram captures these girls. There's a worldwide cry for these girls to come back. Today, it's the year 2021. 2016, or rather 2014 when they were kidnapped, 2015, 16, 17, 18. Where are they? Ladies and gents, on the 7th year anniversary of these young girls being kidnapped, there are approximately 112 of these girls missing. You would have thought that because there's no longer noise about bring back our girls, I honestly can't remember the last time I saw somebody with this, that these girls have been found, but no. 112 remain missing. And many of these girls that were returned back to their families were returned pregnant, having been impregnated by the soldiers that captured them, severely traumatized, as you can imagine. And some of them were known to be dead. There are reports by non-government organizations that some of these young ladies were sold to their captors, or rather sold by their captors to other soldiers for as little as 3 lattes from Starbucks, for as little as $12 US. So we've got terrorism that's on our continent and that we need help with. And there's a country called Israel that can help us. We need Israel's help. Not only is Boko Haram responsible for the kidnapping of those young ladies, Boko Haram, together with the Fulani herdsmen in Nigeria, are responsible for a genocide that's raging in Nigeria at this moment with regards to Christians. Last year, it was reported that over 2,000 Christians in Nigeria were killed. And last year wasn't the first year that it happened. It's been happening for several years. So the question that I have for people is, all right, where's your noise? Where are the human rights activists that are drawing attention to this? I put it to you at the beginning that the African continent that is an African continent that is rich, that has got human potential, rather human capital with vast amounts of potential. We've got wealth, we've got money. So why are we in the state that we are? But we are, and we need help. People talk about slavery. The transatlantic slave trade was awful, absolutely awful. But ladies and gents, do you know that slavery still exists to this very day? This very day on the African continent, there are 5 nations in particular where slavery doesn't just exist, it's unfortunately thriving. These nations, Mauritania, Algeria, Libya, Sudan, we know the numbers of those. In Nigeria, we don't necessarily know the numbers because of, unfortunately, how rampant it is. So again, I say, if you really are interested in Africa, if you're interested in human rights, surely you'd be making noise about this. Now, I know he was online yesterday, Mr. Charles Jacobs. I'm not sure if he's online tonight, but sir, if you are online tonight, on behalf of IPSI, we want to thank you for the great work that you do in bringing attention to the world about the atrocities of the slavery that's currently happening. For a split second, I want us to quickly go back to the slide where I spoke about how when the Arab nations were applying pressure on these African countries to cut ties with Israel, and how for a period of time, they were successful in just staving it off. They were like, one of the reasons why they were able to just go, is because they knew who on their continent was actually inflicting them. I say this not to pinpoint or not to call out a particular religion or a people. I say this because it's a truth. Africans are being enslaved by the Arabs. So when people talk about, oh, Israel is racist and Israel is an apartheid state and Israel is all of this, but they say nothing, of course, all of those accusations are false, but they say nothing about slavery that's happening on the African continent. And they parade, and I say so respectfully, they parade around Black Lives Matter, but they say nothing about the Black lives on the African continent. I call you out as not being 100% true to your cause. If you are true to your cause, you would want Africa to come out of the situation where she is. I also mentioned the fact that Africa has got all of this human capital. It's untapped because of the unfortunate, very high unemployment rates across the continent. The country from which I come from, South Africa, pre-COVID, South Africa had an official unemployment rate of 28%. That was the official rate. The unofficial rate, so taking into account people that didn't participate in the survey or aspects of the survey that didn't necessarily cater to them, but people who are truly unemployed and find themselves on the street, that percentage was 40%. And of that 40%, 70% comprised of young people. So when Africa, acknowledging the fact that she has so much wealth and she can do so much, but has faced with all of this unemployment, the answer isn't only give me a job, give me a job, give me a job. The answer is let's be innovative. Let's be entrepreneurs. Let's create businesses. People in finance and that deal with economics know that it's small businesses that drive the economy. We can look to Israel, consider the startup nation in the world, and the innovation that she presents, how she as a young country, a small country as well, was able to do so well for herself and continues to do so well for herself. Surely there's much that Africa can learn from her, especially her young people. So ladies and gents, I put to you that in today, this relationship that Africa had, this friendship that was broken, needs to be mended. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I am not saying that with regards to these various things that I've commented on, that Israel is our savior, not at all. But to borrow the words of President Uhuru Kenyatta, when Benjamin Netanyahu visited the West as well as the East of Africa in 2016, he said that we will be foolhardy not to recognize that Israel has the capacity, has the learnings, has the means to help us with this. We'd be foolhardy. So just because the world is going to say, why are you being friends with Israel? We're like, okay, she can help us. We need help. And we're going to go to a friend that has proven from over 3,000 years ago, she proved in the early days of us getting our independence that she was a friend of ours. We need to go back to that friendship. And thankfully, that is what is happening. This particular video is when Prime Minister Netanyahu actually visited the African continent. Let's listen for a little bit as to what transpired and what was said.
Africa is a continent on the rise. It could rise to unbelievable heights. The key is to harness technology. Technology changes everything, everything, in water and health, in agricultural production, in dairy, in education, in any field of human endeavor. It's all going to be subjected to this fantastic meeting ground of big data, connectivity, internet, cloud connectivity, and artificial intelligence. There are one or two centers that specialize in the world in this triangle. We are one of them. And we are ready to make that available to you, both as government to government, no less important, companies to companies, companies to government. We can be great partners with you. And we want to be great partners. Africa excites our imagination. Africa is our top priority. I have weekly meetings in my cabinet. I say to them, there's one place you don't need to ask me for permission to go. Go to Africa. All of you, go to Africa. Go to Africa and bring Africa to Israel.
All right, my apologies. I see that was what he said on his tour in Africa. In fact, that's what he said post the tour. And one of the things that was also noted in reports after the particular tour was the fact that Africa was coming to Israel and Israel was coming to Africa. Now let's see an example of what Israel is doing on the African continent.
Innovation Africa brings Israel innovation to African villages. More
because now we have the light we can use for conducting deliveries.
Solar energy helped me that it's night.
Solar water pumping and tera mayonjo maka gange.
Before I move on in terms of our current, our today, if I could also say this, that as Israel, as imperfect as she has been on the continent, we're yet to see her break promises with regards to helping. The one thing that I love about Innovation Africa, that name, it's not a, here's a handout. You can't do this. You have to do it our way, but it's let's empower you. Let's help you for you to do it your way for your people. A few years ago, we know that the United States of America in 2018 moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And present at that opening were 33 countries. If you're looking at this map, you'll see that there's a concentration of blue in the middle of the African continent. Of the 33 nations that were present at the opening of that embassy in Jerusalem, the undivided, eternal capital of Israel, 11 of those countries present were African countries. Africa was present by a third at that incredible time, or at that incredible event. And again, this shows that today, Africa is making strides with regards to reigniting this friendship, this reunion that is happening. Africa is coming to Israel, back to Israel, I should say, and Israel is coming back to Africa. Following the opening of the embassy in Jerusalem, we've had announcements by the nation of Malawi. More recently, we had an announcement by the nation of Equatorial Guinea that they were going to be opening up embassies in Jerusalem. A few years ago, in fact, before the United States moved its embassy, the nation of Zambia expressed its intent to move its embassy to Jerusalem. These are all positive strides that need to happen, that must happen, as we rekindle this friendship between Africa and Israel. In September of the year 2020, we had the historic Abraham Accords that were signed. Abraham Accords signed between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, and this was all facilitated by the Trump administration of the United States of America. Following this, we've seen a domino effect of nations in the Middle East as well as in Africa expressing their intent to normalize their relations with Israel. On the African continent specifically, we've seen indications by Morocco, we've seen indications by Sudan, and recently as well, we've seen indications by Zimbabwe. And this all makes me so excited. Once again, we've already explored the fact that when Israel had relations with Africa, Africa was able to thrive because she had a friend that had her interests at heart and that was helping her. And that if we go back to that friendship, we'll be able to achieve all of the potential that Africa has. And yes, once again, I need to say, Israel's not our savior. There's various other challenges that we need to deal with on the African continent, including corrupt leaders that actually care about lining their back pockets more than they do so their people. But this is a fundamental step, this relationship, for Africa to achieve her potential. The graphic on the left-hand side, you would have seen it on the poster. I don't know how many of you have noticed, though, that the shadows are not the shadows of the persons, a king and a queen, but actually shadows of the map of Israel and the map of Africa. Ladies and gents, these individuals are King Solomon, as well as the Queen of Sheba, or also known as Queen Makeda, per Jewish tradition as well as African tradition. This relationship, if we're going to do our time travel once again, let's go all the way back 3,000 years. And we'll see that Africa offered to Israel diplomacy. The Queen of Sheba made her trek, made her journey from the African continent to pay homage to King Solomon, acknowledging him, acknowledging Israel, and this happened in Jerusalem. She also brought with her resources. She showed the rest of the world, not only then, but also as an example now, that we can also give Israel something, that we can have a relationship that benefits us both. Ladies and gents, Africa has to offer, and again, I'm saying it one more time, a youthful labor force. 60% of the world's youth on the African continent, that's a lot of potential. Africa has this to offer. Growing economies, we've got this to offer. Arable land. Do you know that 60% of the world's arable land, for those of us that may not be familiar with the term arable land, that means land on which there can be agriculture. So the growing of crops, growing of food, that means food security. We can feed the world. We can help feed the world. Political stability. Many times the conversations that are happening are with regards to political instability and war and corruption. We can offer political stability because we don't have it yet, and so that's a potential that we can fulfill. I would also like to say this, if I may, that as there is talk of there being a 6th permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, and that talk is being directed at Africa to say, okay, this 6th permanent seat needs to be occupied by an African state. If we are able to get Africa back in good relations with Israel, and that seat is occupied by an African state that understands and that recognizes the importance of Israel, that understands and that recognizes the legitimacy of Israel to exist as a state, as a homeland for the Jewish people, then Africa will be able to bring some saneness, some stability, some veto power to the United Nations Security Council and help ensure that this organization stops bashing Israel just for absolutely no reason. The United States, yes, I acknowledge, is Israel's most powerful and arguably most important ally. But I put it to you that Africa is Israel's most strategic ally. If you look at the voting that happens in the the United Nations, in the General Assembly, or even on the Security Council, Africa comprises a very large bloc, a bloc that the Arab nations have unfortunately hijacked because they've caused this friendship to be compromised. But this voting bloc needs to go back to voting for what is true, voting what is right with regards to Israel. This gentleman, many of us may not be familiar with, his name is Edward Woolman Blyde. He is considered to be one of the founding fathers of the Pan-African movement. Look at his attitude towards Israel. He expressed in a book that was written at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, not the 21st century. He said, the history of the African race, their enslavement, persecution, proscription, and sufferings closely resembles that of the Jews. And as he spoke, together with other founding fathers of the African movement, including Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first prime minister of Ghana, as they looked at their lands, as they looked at the African nation, as they looked at these independent countries and had a longing for these countries to do well for themselves, they would reference what was going on in Israel. They would reference Zionism and how the Jews were able to go back to their land and establish themselves and be proud and be accomplished. The founding fathers of Pan-Africanism had hopes and dreams for the African continent that it would aspire to do what Israel had done, what the Jews had done. During the liberation movements across the country, or rather across the continent, in the 1950s, 1960s, in fact, even before then, while there was still colonization, this particular song, Nkosi Sikeleli Africa, which its direct translation is God Bless Africa, was an anthem that you could hear being sung across the continent. And I'm going to play a clip for you so you can hear the words of this beautiful medley, written by a man called Enoch Sondota. It is a cry to God for God to bless the continent of Africa. Again, those of us that are people of faith, Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you. God will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. Nkosi Sikeleli Africa, a cry that was not just in the liberation movement, but then also became the national anthem of 5 African states, and today remains the national anthem of 2 African states, including South Africa. As we cry out to God, bless us, help us. He's told us how we can do that, or one of the things that we can do, and that is by blessing Israel. And so the friendship, ladies and gents, I put to you, between Africa and Israel is something that is necessary indeed for God to bless Africa. And I'm a bit emotional because the images in that music video were images that come from apartheid South Africa. So at a time when Black people were crying for liberation from the chains of apartheid, from the evil that was that regime. Many people don't know the fact that not only was South Africa subjected to this incredible evil of segregation just because of the color of their skin, prior to that, we had been colonized twice. And then this happened. So as Africans cried for their own land, they cried for their own recognition. There are people from whom we can learn, people who share the same struggle and who are doing well. And if we are able to strengthen this relationship, which we must and which we are and which we need to continue to work to, then yes, indeed, we'll see God's blessing on the continent and her arise in a way that she's never done before. This particular T-shirt, and this is my last slide, represents a movement that's growing on the African continent where people are very proudly wearing these T-shirts and saying, Africa, your time is now. Africa, indeed, your time is now, not just for yourself, but for the world. You have so much to offer. But in order for us to reach that full potential, we need to remember and stand up for and defend and embrace our friend from Israel. If I can end off with this Bible story, there was a time when the world was in famine, people were hungry. Africa had the resources to feed the world. The king at that time, the pharaoh at that time, had a dream, didn't know what that dream meant, didn't even know at that time that there was going to be famine and that he would be able to help the world. In fact, that's what the dream was later interpreted to be, and it was later interpreted to be that by a Hebrew boy by the name of Joseph, a descendant of Israel. So there, ladies and gentlemen, you had an African continent that was able to and did, in fact, feed many because of the help of a Hebrew boy, because of the help of Israel. Over to you, Maria. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Sorry, there we go. Thank you guys so much for participating. Right now, we are in our Q&A portion. So if you haven't already, please type your question in the chat right here. Or like I said earlier, you can use the reaction function at the bottom of the Zoom to raise your hand, and I can call on you one at a time to unmute your microphones. We ask that you please go right to your question if you're going to ask it verbally and keep it as brief as possible. I don't see anyone with their hand raised right now, so while I go through to make sure no one has their hand raised already, I will start with the questions that I see here in the chat. So the first one that came in, Olga, and answer this the best you can. This comes from Andrea Spindell. So it says, does the heavy Chinese influence in Africa have any negative implications for relations with Israel as it is confronting Western influence and whatnot?
Negative relations for Israel or for Africa?
It says with Israel, but Andrea, if you want to come off mute and maybe explain a little bit more.
Yes, I guess I should have said for both. My understanding is that the Chinese have invested heavily and in some ways influenced or even purchased support from African leaders, which is heavily antagonistic to the US. And so with Israel's presence there also, I'm wondering whether the Chinese are pushing Israel out and not wanting African countries to seek help from what is a Western allied country.
Outside of it being a Western allied country, Andrea, because it's China is looking after its own interests. And so, yes, in fact, those of us on the African continent talk about how Africa is actually going through another form of colonialization. We're going through an economic colonization by the Chinese coming in and purporting to help us with regards to building what we need, infrastructure, giving us loans, but the terms of those loans are such that default is inevitable. And when you default, you're able to call up collateral, and that collateral is our resources, our minerals, our roads. So again, this is why IPSI's work is so important, is because we have to educate Africans as to who our friends really are. And that it's not China. I don't even need to say with respect, it's not China.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Andrea. Our next question from Joey Bancheek, and he asks, you seem to paint Israel's relationship with Africa in a very positive light. What are your thoughts on the Israeli government's support of the South African government during apartheid?
That's a good question, Joey, and thank you for it. It's important that we note the fact, we don't deny it, but let's note it, that Israel is not perfect. And that in the friendship, just as you would with a friend, you have your ups and your downs, you make mistakes, that there was a period of time when Israel actually did support the apartheid government, and that support came through the provision of arms. Interestingly, though, before the provision of those arms, which happened after the 1960s, Israel actually condemned apartheid in South Africa in the 1960s. So later on in the 1970s, we then had this assistance. But if for a moment you think about where Israel was coming from, and again, not giving it as an excuse, but explaining the context of this, because many times it's missing. And so people do with this information what they wish. And they say, you see, you shouldn't support Israel. That as many nations turned their back on Israel following the 1967 war, Israel found herself alone. She also found herself having fewer friends on the African continent, like I explained. And so when the apartheid government said, we need help, she was like, okay, we'll help you if you will continue to be our friend. But then very soon after that, realized that that assistance was not morally correct and cut those ties. One of the things that I say to people that always like to bring this up, and it's a truth, and let's note it, is why is it okay for African countries to be told, to be encouraged to have friendships, relationships with its colonizers? We're told to be friends with the Brits. We're told to be friends with the Dutch. But with Israel, this country that is miles away, and that has shown to actually have done our continent more good than harm, we're told you can't be. That's a double standard. That's hypocrisy. We're told to embrace the Arabs and the Arab leaders when today, as I already expressed, they are enslaving our people. No, we need to again understand that she is a friend of ours and she has been a good friend to us.
Thank you. Our next question from Paul Wilder says, how can our Black African brothers help to move against Farrakhan and the branch of Islam that bashes Jews at every opportunity?
How can you help? Get involved with IPSI. That's why we're here. So IPSI provides education. We'll be doing not only seminars like this, but there's a program that we're very excited about that we're going to be launching in the next couple of months. Not only is your participation in what we do very important to us, your donations, again, I'm not just asking for money. You said, how can we help? I'm letting you know how you can help. We need to get the word out there. And yeah, education is the best way in which we're able to then come against what Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam and everybody else, including the BLM, if I may say so, are wanting to do. But again, education, education, education. Maria will most likely share information as to how you can get involved, not only financially, but in other ways too, at the end of the presentation.
Yes, I will. Donating online is most likely the best way right now, especially with everything going on. So I will put the link for our website in the chat if you guys don't already have it. All right, so our next question comes from Charles Jacobs, and he wants to clarify first, if he has it right, that most African student groups on campuses seem to be pro-Palestinian, and if so, what can be done to correct this?
Hi, Charles. It's a pleasure to see you this evening. So you are correct that here in the United States campuses that most of the Black students seem to be having good relationships with the Palestinian students. And I actually need to applaud these BDS groups, these pro-Palestinian as well as anti-Israel groups, because they have shown a compassion for the cause of the Black people. They've said, we're your friends. So because we're your friend, you need to be our friend and you need to come after our cause. So once again, education, helping these young Black students, and that's something that IPSI has already started to do. Our executive director speaks often on university campuses now because of COVID, primarily via Zoom, has conversations with them, letting them know of the close relationship that their communities had with Israel, that their ancestors still have with the Jewish people. And as they are able to then understand, to say, wait a minute, the Jews are our friends actually, and this is what they've done. And then also conversely, and I say it respectfully, this is what's happening with regards to the Arab leaders and the Palestinian authorities and Hamas, and we need to call those people out, how they are actually not your friends. This is what they're doing. This is what they're doing to your people, including on the African continent, including with regards to slavery. Then hopefully we'll start to see a shift that this relationship that exists with them is actually misguided, and that the true relationship should be with the people that have shown themselves true to them, and that's the Jewish people.
Thank you. Our next question from Deborah Glazer. She asked what, or if we are getting this message to US and European Black communities, and what are the positions of the various Black church denominations on Israel?
I'm assuming that when she says this particular message, she's talking about the ancient friendship with Israel, or just the, oh, Liz, do you want to clarify that? Oh, I thought I saw somebody speaking. So yes, once again, IPSI, not only in this particular forum, is providing education. We've got resources that are also available. You would have seen a slide at the beginning of our presentation, for those of you that came before the 8 o'clock timeline, that our founder, Dumisani Washington, he's actually just released the second edition of his book, Zionism and the Black Church. And in there, not only does he speak in depth on the relationship between Israel and Africa historically as well as now, but he also looks at the relationship between Israel as well as the Jews and the Black community and the ancestors. It's a book and a resource that I encourage every one of us here to get and to share. As to what the attitude of the Black pastors are, Black denominations are, I'm going to defer that question to tomorrow, so that Pastor Dumisani Washington, he's a pastor and he speaks a lot in his capacity as the Diversity Outreach Coordinator of Christians United for Israel. He has these conversations often, and he'll be able to give a better sense of what that attitude is. I don't speak to pastors, so I'm not equipped to answer that.
Thank you. Yes, hopefully everybody will be joining us again tomorrow evening for the final discussion. This next question we have here is from David Eisenberg, and we only have a couple minutes, so I will see how quickly we can answer this one before I decide what's the last question. But they asked, this one's a couple parts. So it says, how can the reality of one, Israel's help and ties to Africa be conveyed to the Black communities in the US? Two, how can the contrast of people of the Jewish religion having friendly ties to Africa compared to some Islamic extremists be publicized? And then also this question also applies to the comparison to the absence of assistance from some Arab and European nations. I can repeat that if you need me to.
Okay, so I think questions 1 and 3, again, it's education, it's information. People don't know. And once you know, then you're able to not only accurately respond, but you can take the necessary steps with regards to action. Maria, could you please repeat the second question? I'm not sure that I understood that.
Yes. How can the contrast of people of the Jewish religion having friendly ties to Africa compared to some Islamic extremists be publicized?
I mean, I'm assuming other than, again, education campaigns that IPSI is going to be running, partnerships that we have, you would have seen also on our flyer that we've got partnerships, or rather we had sponsors with various organizations, and some of those organizations have invited us to speak on their platforms to highlight the contrast and to give information on what can be, what should be. So without sounding like a broken record, education, 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 exposure, 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 including on social media platforms, as well as in person, hopefully, once COVID ends.
All right, so I will just ask this last question, and then we'll be wrapping up for the evening. So a question from Anita Bromberg. She is mentioning what Bishop Tutu has raised against Israel. I'm assuming this is a recent thing as well. So the question is, what do you think motivated him to do that, and what can be said to counter that?
One of the questions, if I may, in answering, also tell you a question that I'm asked is, Olga, who are you? Bishop Tutu is such a stately man and did such a wonderful thing for South Africa's liberation and is widely respected across the world. If he says that Israel is an apartheid state, if he says that there should be no relations by Africans with Israel, then who are you to tell us that, that they should? The wonderful thing about education, the wonderful thing about truth and facts is that it equals the playing field. It levels the playing field. So even though he's very well respected, and I respect him as my elder, Bishop Tutu is wrong. His information is wrong. He's not telling the truth. What we're saying can be verified. History is there. The truth of the narrative is that Israel is not an apartheid state. African nations have had good relations with Israel. African nations, many of them, even though they cut their ties, some maintained that relation. And as we can see, that those relations are being revived. So the whole notion that we should not have anything to do with Israel, I think thankfully is starting to gain traction with African leaders, that this whole apartheid thing, this whole isolation thing with Israel is not only not true, it's not helpful to us as Africans.
Thank you.